Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as I share 22 mid-spring blooming perennials in my yard. So let's go. I live in New Hampshire. I garden in zone 5B and my average last frost date is around May 15th. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, our spring months fall between March 20th through June 20th. It is currently early February, and just so you know, where I live, from the months of November through March, I have nothing blooming out in my garden, which is kind of sad because that's 5 months of the year. So for that reason, I really look forward to those early blooming perennials, and I like to pack them in my yard during the early spring months. This video will mostly focus on perennials that are blooming mid-spring in my garden, and that typically falls during the months of late April through mid-May. But in case you're interested, I did make a video of the very first plants that bloom in my garden during the early spring months. I'll put a link to that video down in the description area in case you want to check it out. And depending on your climate, some of the plants that I'm going to be talking about today may bloom earlier or later where you live. And I just want to put it out there, most of the plants are toxic if you ingest them. So it's probably a good idea not to be eating the plants and instead just enjoy them for how beautiful they look. Many of the plants in my garden, including plants in this video, came from a division from my mother-in-law's yard. For that reason, I typically won't know the exact cultivar name, but I will be able to at least share general information about all of the plants. Okay, we have a lot of plants to talk about today, so let's start with our first plant. I love the small leaf rhododendron, and I have two varieties. I have the PJM, which is a purple color, and the Olga Mezit, which is more of a pink color. These are compact evergreen rhododendron shrubs that provide a lot of interest from spring all the way through the winter months. In fact, the leaves turn a nice mahogany red color during the fall, and the leaves stay on the plant through the winter months, just to add that winter interest in the yard. I have the small leaf rhododendrons in a number of places in my yard. I have it up along the driveway on the right-hand side, a few of them in fact. I also have 3 of them up along my front walkway, which I do plan to move later this season, so be on the lookout for that. And I have some small ones that are in a temporary holding spot in my old arborvitae flower bed. They were put there because they came from my mother-in-law's house after she passed away, and I had them up along my driveway initially. They were not thriving. They weren't getting the conditions that they needed. So now I have them in a temporary holding spot just so that they can take off over time. And then I have some more sprinkled throughout my yard because they really do add that nice color that I need in the early to mid-spring months. Small leaf rhododendrons are hardy in USDA zones 4 through 9. They grow from 3 to 6 feet in height, and they prefer full to part sun. In this video, whenever I talk about anything that's deer and rabbit resistant, just take that with a grain of salt. If the deer are hungry, they will eat the plant. The flowers attract the butterflies, bees, as well as the hummingbirds. The next plant I really enjoy. It's called leopard's bane. In fact, it's one of the first perennials to actually bloom in your yard that's not considered a spring bulb. It has yellow daisy-like flowers with medium green foliage and deep-toothed leaves. Most of these plants that I have are located in my front yard, which is the west side of my house. I call it the bay flower bed where the plants are located. And they just look so pretty in there, and I made a conscious effort not to put any daffodils in that area because I want the yellow daisy-like flowers to really stand out by themselves. I also have this plant sprinkled in my backyard, which is on the east side of my house. And then I also have some of this plant on the north side of my house, and it looks very pretty there as well. The plant is hardy in zones 4 through 8, and it grows about 1 to 3 feet in height. Where I live, our summers don't get extremely hot, so for that reason, this plant can do well in the full sun if you live in a cool region. But if you live in a much warmer region, you definitely want to put this plant in a shadier location. But not full shade. It prefers part shade if you're going to put it in a shadier area. Here where I live in New Hampshire, our summers don't generally get too hot, so I can get away with planting this in a full sun location. But if you live somewhere where your summers get very hot, then you'll want to plant the leopard's bane in a part sun condition. The plant thrives in moist, well-draining soil, and it's deer and rabbit resistant. It makes for a good cut flower, and for pollinators, it attracts the bees, the butterflies, as well as the hummingbirds. The leopard bane plant is native to parts of Europe. The next plant I just love. I think it's so striking. It's called the English primrose. It is compact and semi-evergreen, especially in warmer climates. They are grown for their colorful and fragrant flowers. They come in a variety of shades, including pink, red, yellow, orange, purple, or white. The flowers can be single or double, and they can come in flat or tubular forms. I don't have many of the primrose in my yard, but I have enough and I'm happy with it. I have most of them near my hosta garden, which is in my backyard. It's on the east side of my house. And I've had success dividing this plant, and my goal is every single year to keep dividing it just to increase my stock in this plant. A few years ago, I had success winter sowing the primrose. It was a seed that I got from Baker Creek, and it was called the Wanda Mixed Colors. I was able to pot up those seedlings. They are still in my backyard plant nursery. Well, you better believe it. This coming spring, I will be taking those plants and I'll be putting them somewhere in my landscape. The plants are hardy in USDA zones 4 through 8, and they grow about 4 to 6 inches in height. The plants thrive in a variety of sun conditions, from part sun to part shade. Here where I live, I could get away with putting this plant in a full sun condition. You wouldn't want to do that though if you live in a very hot climate. You want to plant this where it has humus-rich, consistently moist, well-draining soil. The plants are deer and rabbit resistant, and they attract the butterflies. And you'll find this plant native in southern and western parts of Europe. Next up, we have the flowering almond. I got a small sprig of this plant from my mother-in-law's home, and it has stayed alive. It looks pretty in my yard, but I'm planning to move it this year. I'd like it to put it in a location where it gets a little bit more sun, and hopefully it'll take off and be happier there. It's a multi-stemmed deciduous shrub or small tree with a rounded crown that bears light pink or occasionally white double flowers. So I currently have this on the north side of my house. This plant sometimes will send off suckers, and you can get new plants that way. So I will take a look at it this spring, and after it's done blooming, if I do have suckers at that time, I will divide the plant, but for sure I'll move it to somewhere where it's going to thrive and take off and be a little bit happier. Flowering almond is hardy in USDA's zones 4 through 8, and it grows about 4 to 6 feet in height. It thrives in full to part sun, and it prefers well-draining soil. It is said to be deer and rabbit resistant, and the bees and butterflies flock to this plant. Flowering almond is native to certain parts of Asia. Okay, this next plant I am super excited about, and if the conditions are right and you don't have this plant, I highly recommend it in your plant. It's called the Fringed bleeding heart. And when you hear bleeding heart, you might think you know what I'm talking about, but hear me out. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this plant, and when you see the picture of it, you'll be surprised that maybe it's different than what you thought. It's a compact, bushy perennial with ferny gray-green leaves. It has nodding, heart-shaped flowers, and they come in either a pink or a white color, and in fact, I have both. The plant almost always does not go dormant. In fact, it will bloom during the spring months all the way up until your first frost, which you can't say that about a lot of perennials. That's what I love about this plant. I have a couple of big clumps of this plant on the south side of my house. When you come up my driveway on the right-hand side, that's where they're located. And they just put on such a great show, and anytime people come over, that's one of the few plants in my yard where they just want to know what it is because it's so interesting and different. I also have the French bleeding heart tucked in a few areas on the north side of my house, and then I also have this plant located on the east side of my house, right near my hosta garden. And in fact, in that area, the French bleeding heart looks really pretty next to the hellebores and the heucheras that are also right near it. The plants are hardy in USDA zones 3 through 9, and they grow between 1 to 2 feet in height. They prefer part sun to part shade conditions, and they thrive in moist, well-draining soil. The plants are said to be deer and rabbit resistant, and they attract the hummingbirds, the bees, and even the butterflies. And what's really neat is you will find that this plant is considered native in certain parts of eastern United States. Okay, since we're talking about bleeding heart, I can't not mention the old-fashioned bleeding heart. Now, both types of bleeding hearts will bloom at the same time, initially during the spring months. But then what will happen with the old-fashioned bleeding heart is actually it will go dormant. It will die back to the ground as soon as the temperatures warm up. The old-fashioned bleeding heart has graceful arching stems full of pink heart-shaped flowers and protruding white petals. Here's a fun budget-friendly tip. If you do want this plant, I highly recommend you try looking for it bare root in your big box stores during the early spring months. It is a lot cheaper to buy this plant that way than it is to buy it from, let's say, a garden center or a nursery. The old-fashioned bleeding heart is one of those perennials that blooms for a long period of time. It blooms anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks long. Now, I mentioned that the plant eventually goes dormant. In my yard, because I have it right next to my drip irrigation and it's in a little bit of a shadier area, it takes a while before it actually goes dormant. So keep that in mind. If you have it tucked in an area that's definitely on the shadier side and it's moist over in that area, then the plant may take longer to go dormant in your yard. I have a large clump of the old-fashioned bleeding heart in this one area that's up on the driveway on the right-hand side on the south side of my house. I really need to divide it. So I am planning to divide it a couple of different ways. I've never done root divisions of the plant, so I'm going to try to do that. And then I'm also going to try to dig it up and divide it. But I definitely don't want to do it anytime near when it's about to bloom. As some of you know, I live in an area where I have a lot of shade in my yard, so I really want to move this plant around to different areas of my yard this year. Old-fashioned bleeding heart is hardy in USDA's zones 3 through 9, and it grows anywhere from 2 to 3 feet in height. It thrives in full sun to shady locations, and it prefers humus-rich, moist, well-draining soil. Now, I've never cut the flowers and put it in a vase, but I've heard you can do that, and it has a very good vase life of about 2 weeks. The plant is considered deer and rabbit resistant, and it attracts the butterflies as well as the bees. The plant is native actually to a number of areas, including Siberia, northern China, Korea, as well as Japan. Next, we have a shrub. It's called the Korean or Meyer lilac. It's a small, slow-growing, deciduous shrub with fragrant flowers that come in shades of lavender pink to purple violet. I have these located in 2 areas of my yard. One area is up the driveway on the right, southern part of my house, and I have a bunch of them that are just tucked in that area. Now, I've never been good about cutting them back and trying to prune them so they have a better shape and a better form. That's one thing I'm going to try to do this year. And I also have this located on the north side of my house. I put it there along with a lot of other perennials temporarily. So you'll see me moving a lot of plants this year into what I feel are better locations in my yard. But for right now, the plant is happy, it's living, it blooms every year, and I'm excited to move it to other areas of my yard. Korean lilac is hardy in USDA's zones 3 through 9, and it gets to be about 5 to 8 feet in height. The shrub prefers full sun, and it likes rich, well-draining soil. And if you wanted to, you could cut on the flowers and you could put them in a vase. It has a shorter vase life, but nevertheless, the vase life is about 3 to 5 days. The shrub is considered deer and rabbit resistant, and it attracts the bees, butterflies, as well as the hummingbirds. And you'll find that Korean lilac is considered native to parts of Beijing as well as China. There are so many different kinds of iris out there, and what I love about iris is that you can get iris to be blooming at different times of the year. And when I was reviewing some pictures as well as videos of what was blooming in my garden during the middle of spring, I found 2 different types of iris that were blooming during that time. And both of the iris I received from my friend Linda. She has a backyard plant nursery, so I know a little bit information about each of these plants. The first is a yellow standard dwarf bearded iris, and I only have it in one area of my yard where I just basically plunked it in the ground. And every year when it blooms, I think, how beautiful is it? And just like a lot of other plants, I will be moving this iris around in the spring after it's done blooming. But I really want to tell you a little bit about this next iris. It's called Iris cristata, or the dwarf crested iris. It's a small iris with blue-violet flowers that are distinctly marked with a central yellow or white purple striped band. And when I read that it's a fast-growing kind of ground cover of an iris, that's so true. This plant definitely spreads, and I love that it spreads as fast as it does. In fact, it gives you that really nice drift of blue color that looks so pretty in your yard during the middle of spring. I planted it in a small grouping on the south side of my house, and it has multiplied so much during the last few years that I've had this in my garden. This iris is hardy in USDA's zones 3 through 9, and it grows about 3 to 9 inches in height. It thrives in part shade to shade, and it prefers a rich, well-draining soil. This iris is deer and rabbit resistant, and the bees and hummingbirds really like the flowers on this plant. And just like many of you, I am working really hard to add more native plants to my gardens. And this iris is considered native here where I live in New Hampshire. It's considered native in certain parts of eastern and southern United States. And if you ever want to know if this plant or other plants are native where you live, a quick Google search should tell you whether or not the plants are native. Next we have the bridal wreath spirea. It's a medium-sized deciduous shrub with upright arching habit and cascading waterfalls of white double flowers. In my yard, I have two different types of bridal wreath spirea. One of them I got from my sister-in-law's home, and I would say the habit or the form on that spirea is a little bit more of a wilder, looser look. And then I have another type of bridal wreath spirea that I got from my mother-in-law's yard. And I would say the habit on that is a little more formal, a little more upright. And both of these bridal wreath spireas are located in a few different areas of my yard. So I really look forward to them when they bloom because they just add that really nice white pop of color that I really enjoy and I like in my yard during the spring months. This kind of spirea is hardy in USDA's zones 5 through 8, and it can grow anywhere from 4 to 8 feet in height. They thrive in full sun and they prefer a well-draining soil. The shrub is considered to be deer and rabbit resistant, and they attract the bees as well as the butterflies. Bridal wreath spirea is considered native to certain parts of Japan, China, Korea, as well as Taiwan. This next plant is very, very striking, and when people come visit me and they see it blooming, a lot of people wonder what it is because I don't think it's as common as I feel that it should be. I feel like it should be in everyone's yard because it's just so pretty in the spring. It's called candytuft, and it's a flowering, woody subshrub, though it is sometimes categorized as a perennial, known for its clusters of small, multi-petaled white or pastel flowers. And if you need plants that are really drought tolerant, then this is the plant for you because it can do well with very little water. I mostly have candytuft on the south side of my house, and I have it in a few places. I have it on the side walkway bed, and then I also have it in the old arborvitae bed. It's hardy in USDA's zones 3 through 9, and it gets anywhere from 12 to 18 inches in height. It does well in full to part sun, but it really does prefer a well-draining soil. The plant is considered deer and rabbit resistant, and the bees and butterflies definitely flock to this plant. Candytuft is native to Europe as well as to parts of the Mediterranean. And before I tell you about the next plant, I have 3 cats, and this is my calico cat, and her name is Callie. The next plant that's blooming in my yard during the mid-spring months is called Basket of Gold. It's a low-growing evergreen perennial with golden yellow flowers. I have it on the south side of my house, and I have it actually right near where the candytuft is, and they both bloom at the same time. So between the white-colored flowers of the candytuft and the yellow-colored flowers of the Basket of Gold, it just looks very pretty and very striking. Basket of Gold is hardy in USDA's zones 3 through 7, and it can grow anywhere from 6 to 12 inches in height. It thrives in full sun, and it does really well in average to sandy, well-draining soil. Plant is considered to be deer and rabbit resistant, and the bees and butterflies love the flowers. Basket of Gold is considered native to certain parts of Europe as well as the Mediterranean. The next plant is bugleweed or ajuga. Now, I know some of you are going to tell me, no, don't get this plant. It's invasive. It'll take over the world. That is true of many ground covers, and what I always will say in my videos is the purpose of a ground cover is to cover the ground. So you want to place all your ground covers, including bugleweed, in an area where you want this plant to take over. I have it in one area of my yard where it's not going to go crazy. It's in a very contained area. It does very well there. And if it starts crawling a little too much, I can always pull it out very easily. Bugleweed is a fast-growing, herbaceous perennial ground cover plant that does a good job of choking out weeds. It has blue-violet flowers, and even though it's invasive in some areas, it's very easy to control and contain it. I have 2 kinds of ajuga in my yard. One of them is the black scalloped, and I have that in the old arborvitae bed on my south side of my house. I also have the chocolate chip ajuga. It's currently temporarily in my plant nursery, potted up, ready to go. I got it from my friend Linda, who has the plant nursery, and I'm planning to plant that somewhere in my landscape sometime this year. Ajuga is hardy in USDA's zones 3 through 10 and can grow anywhere from 3 to 12 inches in height. It prefers full to part sun and thrives in moist, well-draining soil. The plant is considered to be deer and rabbit resistant, and it attracts the pollinators such as the hummingbirds, the bees, the wasps, as well as the butterfly. You'll find that this plant is considered native to many areas, including Europe, Asia, Africa, as well as Australia. The next plant I want to share with you is called foamflower or tiarella. It has finely dissected green leaves with a dramatic dark burgundy center and a nicely rounded habit. For flowers, it has creamy bottle brush-like flowers that cover the entire plant. I have this plant in two areas of my yard. One is on the east side of my house, right near my hosta garden. It adds such a nice little pop of color when it's in bloom with the white flowers. But even when the flowers go by, the leaves alone are very striking and very interesting. I also have this plant on the northern side of my house in a temporary holding spot where one year I just divided a whole bunch of this plant and I put it out there with a bunch of hosta. And what's exciting is now I have a ton more of this plant that I can then take and place in other areas of my yard this year. The plant is hardy in USDA's zones 3 through 9, and it grows anywhere between 8 to 10 inches in height. The plant thrives in full to part shade, and when it comes to soil, it prefers a humus-rich, moist, well-draining soil. The plant is considered deer and rabbit resistant, and it attracts bees, butterflies, as well as the flies. There are a number of foamflower or tiarella that are native to many parts of the United States. As far as I know, the foamflower that I have is native to this part of New Hampshire, but do your research if that's important to you, because many of the tiarella or foamflower that are out there are native to the United States, but then there are some that are not. Okay, the next plant is the spotted dead nettle, also known as lamium. It is a low-spreading, near evergreen plant that becomes mounded. This ground cover can be found with different colors of flowers, including purple, pink, white, or even yellow. And even after the blossoms have gone by, the variegation on the leaves is just so interesting. You'll find it with certain colors of white or even silver in the variegated leaves. Since lamium is considered part of the mint family, it can also be considered invasive. So you just want to keep the plant in check. And also you are able to very easily remove this plant if you find that it's sprawling or spreading a little too much in your yard. In fact, one thing I like to do with this plant is I really enjoy putting it in my pots and containers. It acts as a nice filler as well as a spiller in any container. I mostly have this plant on the east side of my house, and it looks really pretty there. I have it towards the front of my flower bed, and that's where I dig up plants and then I can put them in my containers. Lamium is considered hardy in USDA zones 3 through 8, and it can grow anywhere from 4 to 8 inches in height. It will do well in part sun. It will even do well in shade. I wouldn't want to put this in a full sun condition because what would happen is it might scorch its leaves. The plant thrives in humus-rich, moist, well-draining soil. It's considered to be deer and rabbit resistant, and it attracts the bees, the butterflies, and even the hummingbirds. The plant is considered native in Europe as well as North Africa and western parts of Asia. So far, almost all the plants that I've talked about were plants that I just got as divisions from my mother-in-law's home. But I know that this next plant is a plant that I bought a number of years ago. I got it on clearance and at the end of the season, and it's called the flowering quince. It's a multi-stemmed, deciduous, and thorny shrub with a somewhat messy growth habit, but it produces beautiful, short-lived red, orange, white, or pink flowers and shiny dark green foliage. Now the one that I have is a part of the Double Take series. It does not have thorns on it, and I can tell you that it doesn't have a messy form to it. It's very compact and very neat. I only have one of this plant, and the shrub is located on the north side of my house, and when it blooms, it just looks so beautiful. The flowers almost look like little mini roses, and they're just very delicate, and I really enjoy it when it is in bloom. This quince is hardy in USDA zones 4 through 9, and it grows anywhere from 4 to 5 feet in height. The shrub prefers full sun and moist, well-draining soil. It's considered to be deer and rabbit resistant, and it attracts the hummingbirds, the butterflies, the bees, as well as the moths. And you'll find that it's native in certain areas of China, Tibet, as well as Burma. The next plant is Jacob's Ladder. And I would say of all the spring flowering plants that I have, this one to me is very unique, very different, very interesting. And I feel like in our gardens, we don't have enough flowers that are a blue color flower. So when this is blooming with its blue blossoms, I just think it looks very pretty. And I would say of the 20 years I've been living in this house, this was one of the first plants that I got for my yard. I believe I bought it, but I don't remember, to be honest with you, but I'm pretty sure I bought it. Unfortunately, I did not keep the tag of it, so I'm not sure what kind of Jacob's Ladder I have. I'm almost positive it's the one that's native to the area where I live in New Hampshire. So there are two kinds of Jacob's Ladder, or polemonium, that I researched. And the one that I think I have for my yard is the polemonium reptans. It's a low-growing wildflower that spreads native to the eastern parts of North America. It has light blue to purple bell-shaped flowers in loose clusters, and it also has interesting compound leaves. I currently have this plant on the north side of my house, and I have quite a bit of this plant. So I'm planning to move this around as well, because I just want to have those blue clusters of flowers all over my yard during the middle of spring. It's hardy in USDA zones 3 through 8 and grows to about 1 foot in height. It thrives in shade, but if you are going to move it more towards a full sun situation, you need to make sure you're giving it plenty of moisture. It prefers moist, humus-rich, well-draining soil. It's considered to be deer and rabbit resistant, and it attracts the bees, butterflies, as well as the moths. The plant is considered to be native in many parts of the United States. I'm almost positive the one that I have in my yard is native to New Hampshire. And you'll even find that it's native in certain parts of Canada. So if you are wanting to have the native variety of Jacob's Ladder, just do some research on it and try to make sure that you're getting the right variety for your yard. The realities of making videos for YouTube. There will be wardrobe changes because sometimes we video the next day and then sometimes cats will appear. But on to the next plant. The next plant is actually a tree. It's the flowering crabapple tree. I did buy this from a big box store a few years ago. I don't know the variety, but I have it on the north side of my house, and it's a few years old. It is really, really pretty when it's blooming, and it has magenta pink colored flowers on it, which I really enjoy. There are a lot of type of ornamental flowering crabapple trees out there, but generally speaking, they're hardy in USDA zones 4 through 8, and they can grow anywhere between 4 to 40 feet tall. They typically thrive in full sun, and they like moist, well-draining soil. Most flowering crabapple trees are deer and rabbit resistant, and they attract pollinators such as bees, wasps, and butterflies. The next plant is a ground cover. Again, ground covers can be controversial because they can take over an area. What I do tell people also, especially when they're buying plants from my backyard plant nursery, is place ground covers in an area where you want them to take over. Do not place them in the middle of a flower bed, because if you place them in the middle of the flower bed, they will eventually choke out other plants. And that's exactly what I did when I first started gardening. I put this periwinkle, or Lessa vinca, in a flower bed, and eventually it started to take over, and I had to rip the whole thing out. Lesser periwinkle, or vinca minor, is a vigorous ground cover with blooms in shades of lavender, purple, and mauve. It can be invasive in certain areas, but it can also be good because it suppresses weeds and can control erosion. I mostly have this plant up along my driveway, and I use it specifically to help with erosion control. But I also will dig it up and pot it up and sell it, because a lot of times people will reach out to me asking for a good plant that they need on some sort of a slope in order to control erosion. So it does have a lot of great benefits to it if you use it properly in the landscape. The plant is hardy in USDA zones 3 through 8, and it grows between 4 to 6 inches in height. And it can do well in full sun, part sun, or even shade. And when I do say full sun, that's more for cooler regions, not necessarily where it gets very hot. It appreciates average, well-draining soil, and it's deer and rabbit resistant. The flowers attract bees as well as butterflies, and the plant is considered native in Europe as well as Asia. Another thing I did want to share about this vinca is it does look pretty in pots and containers as a spiller. So it's always nice when you can take a perennial and put it in a pot and use it for that purpose as well. The next plant I want to share is called English or lawn daisy. I've had it in my yard for I'd say 3 years now, and I had bought a packet of seeds. A lot of times you'll find them at big box stores. I winter sowed it, and the first year the plants didn't do anything because the plant is typically considered a biennial. And then the second year is when it bloomed. What I did was I put it near my pond, which is in the front side of my house, and it looks so pretty, very dainty, very sweet, very cute. I just love how short it is with the little white daisy flowers on it. What I will say about it is when the plant goes to seed, you'll end up with a ton of baby plants everywhere. So just keep that in mind. It can spread a little aggressively if you do allow it to go to seed. But if you cut back the blossoms after it's done blooming, what it will do is it'll actually force the plant to bloom again, especially in the fall time, because the plant thrives in cool conditions. So in other words, it's going to bloom in the spring and then it can potentially bloom again in the fall. And for the color of the flowers, they're usually shades of red, pink, or white, and they have a yellow center for the eye. English daisies are hardy in USDA zones 4 through 8, and they grow between 3 to 6 inches in height. They thrive in part sun and they appreciate moist, well-draining soil. The plants are considered deer and rabbit resistant, and they attract bees as well as butterflies. English daisies are considered native in parts of Europe. Well, I have quite a few ground covers to share with you, but I think that's what's so nice about having a ground cover is especially when it blooms. And a lot of the ground covers that I have in my yard specifically bloom in the springtime. And the next one is another example. It's called sweet woodruff. And this ground cover is new to me. I actually only have it in my plant nursery. I do plan on putting it somewhere in my landscape this year. But it has dainty little white flowers on it. And when the blossoms go by, the foliage still looks very pretty, very simple. I really think it's a nice ground cover to have in the yard. The plants are hardy in USDA zones 4 through 8, and they can grow anywhere between 6 to 12 inches in height. They do well in either a part sun or even in a shady situation. They thrive in moist, well-draining soil, and they are deer and rabbit resistant. The bees and the butterflies like the flowers on this plant, and the plant is considered native in Africa, Asia, as well as Europe. The next plant is such a popular plant when it comes to my backyard plant nursery. It's called creeping or moss phlox. I want to share 2 things that I found about this plant when it comes to selling it in a plant nursery. Number 1, as soon as garden centers have it, people flock to this plant, and then the plant sells out. I find that's when I start getting people coming to me and trying to find this plant for their yard because they tell me that the plant nurseries have sold out of the plant. The other thing I've learned about creeping phlox is a lot of people, for whatever reason, struggle with knowing how to divide this plant. And in case you have this plant and you struggle with how to divide it, I'll put a link to a video down in the description in case you're interested, because I did make a video showing the process for how to divide creeping phlox. It's a low-growing ground cover, often found in rock gardens or along a rock wall. You'll often find it in different shades of purples, pinks, as well as white. Creeping phlox is hardy in USDA zones 5 through 9, and it grows between 6 to 12 inches in height. It thrives in full to part sun, and it appreciates loamy, well-draining soil. The plants are considered deer and rabbit resistant, and the flowers attract the bees, the butterflies, and even the hummingbirds. I was surprised to find out that creeping phlox is considered native to many parts of the United States. So if you're interested in this plant and you want to see if it's native to where you live, just do a quick search on the internet to find out if creeping phlox or moss phlox is native in your state. This next plant was a total surprise to me because I really didn't know what to expect. It's called Grecian windflower. I bought the bulbs for this plant, I believe it must have been in the fall time a number of years ago from a big box store. And on the package, when I read about the hardiness, I was surprised to see that it was hardy in my zone. It just looked like a flower that I didn't think would be hardy. Well, I have to tell you, this plant comes back year after year, and it's such a pretty plant. I definitely will be moving this plant around as well because I just think it's such a neat looking plant to have in the yard. And what I've also noticed about it is that it naturalizes very nice. So if you did want to make a bulb lawn, for example, this would make a great plant in a bulb lawn situation. It has vibrant daisy-like flowers that come in shades of white, blue, which really is purple, but you know in the gardening world we say blue, or even shades of pink. It's hardy in USDA zones 4 through 8, and it can grow anywhere between 4 to 6 inches in height. It thrives in full to part sun, and it appreciates moist, well-draining soil. Grecian windflower is deer and rabbit resistant, and it attracts the bees. And then finally, you'll find that this plant is native to parts of Greece as well as Turkey. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I couldn't believe how many plants I found when I was looking through some of my old videos of plants that were blooming during the mid-spring months. And my hope is that you're inspired and maybe you got a few ideas of plants that you want to have for your own garden. And again, remember, these plants that I've listed may bloom a little earlier or a little later where you live, depending on your climate and your situation when it comes to temperature. But nevertheless, they should bloom sometime in the springtime, which is a nice bonus, I feel. And I did want to mention, when I was looking at the videos and putting this video together, there was a flower that I forgot to talk about. And it's called, I think you pronounce it Pasquet flower. It is so pretty and so unique. And I do have it in my side walkway garden. You might have seen a glimpse of it. It was right near the candytuft and the basket of gold. It's a purple color flower. It's just so unique and different. And I'm surprised that I didn't call it out, but I think I didn't call it out because it really wasn't in full bloom. Plus I don't have many of this particular plant, but you better believe it. If I ever make another video like this, I will be adding that plant to that video. I'm not sure about your garden and where you live, but where I live in New Hampshire, when it comes to spring, especially early spring, as well as fall, it's really hard to find a good variety of plants that are hardy in zone 5B during those months. So I'm always on the lookout for plants. I feel for summertime, many of us have so much different choices when it comes to perennials. Spring and fall, I think, can be a little tricky. So if I left out any plants that bloom early to mid-spring, please drop them down in the comment section below. I'm hoping to make a video on plants that are blooming late spring in my yard. So don't worry, I know I forgot a lot of plants, but that's because they bloom in the late spring months. Some of those plants are like columbine and peonies, lots of other plants that bloom in the late spring months here. But if you know of any plants that are blooming early to mid-spring, let me know because maybe it's something I want to add to my yard. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.